Welcome everybody, distinguished panelists and participants. I am Olivia Rope, Executive Director of Penal Reform International, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's event. Firstly, a couple of housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. We have English and Spanish interpretation. So we invite you to choose your channel, either English or Spanish, through the interpretation button that should be available to you on the bottom of your screen. And we are also taking questions through the Q&A function, which we hope to address after hearing from the panel. We have over 100 participants today. And so we may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we do welcome comments and questions from you all. We meet today virtually to mark an important milestone. Nearly 10 years ago, on the 21st of December 2010, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution which contained the UN rules for the treatment of female prisoners and non-custodial measures for women offenders. These had been initiated by the government of Thailand, and it was therefore decided that they would be known as the Bangkok Rules. The adoption of the Bangkok Rules was a giant step forward in the recognition that women in the criminal justice system have specific characteristics and needs. And through their unanimous adoption, the 193 countries who were then a member of the UN were stating that they not only recognized these needs, but that they agreed to address them through implementing the Bangkok Rules. They were a long time coming. The UN Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners were initially adopted in 1957, and these only contained a few provisions relating to women. There were some very obvious gaps, like the provision of shaving kit being required, but no mention of sanitary pads for women. Now these standards have been updated in 2015 and they're known as the Nelson Mandela Rules, of which the Bangkok Rules supplement, providing the gender lens. Penal Reform International contributed to the development of the Bangkok Rules and has since then disseminated them, implemented them, raised awareness about them, and probably most of all, created many partnerships along the way over the past decade to build a movement to firstly challenge the imprisonment of women, which in many cases is disproportionate, unnecessary, and damaging, and also to improve the conditions for women who are in prison. And we will hear from many of these partners today. So one person who was at the General Assembly when the Bangkok Rules were adopted was Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General of the UN between 2007 and 2016. Mr. Ban is an elder and Deputy Chair of the Elders, and we will now have the pleasure of hearing opening remarks through his video statement.
Meeting to mark the 10th. I'm pleased to open this important meeting to mark the 10-year anniversary of the Bangkok Rules, the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of women prisoners. I clearly remember attending meetings to help steer forward the adoption of these rules, whilst the UN Secretary General championed by the leadership of Thailand. The Bangkok Rules were a milestone acknowledging that criminal justice systems must be gender responsive. They were also well overdue, adopted 50 years after the UN Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners. This year, we also mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Governments must prioritize access to justice for women by investing in legal aid and legal empowerment services and taking steps to increase women's participation in justice leadership and delivery. Although progress has been made, governments must still do more to fully implement these important rules. It is also sobering to note that the female prison population has grown at a faster rate than men and has increased by over 50% since 2000. The Bangkok Rules also promote alternatives to imprisonment for women, particularly in light of the health risks posed by COVID-19. Governments must do more to make sure that imprisonment is used as a last resort. This will help us to meet the SDG 16.3 indicator of a decrease in pre-trial detention. Leaders and policymakers should heed the recommendations from the WHO and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to use alternatives to imprisonment to reduce the overall prison population, but in particular for pregnant women, women with children, elderly women, and those with less than 12 months left to serve on their sentence. The SDG agenda implores us to leave no one behind and to ensure equal access to justice for all. The American feminist activist Angela Davis once said that, I quote, "Prison relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism," unquote. In 2020, the twin imperatives of pandemic response and anti-racism means we all need to face up to our responsibilities and seriously engage with the root causes of women's imprisonment so we can fully deliver justice for all. Thank you.
I think Mr. Ben's opening remarks touched on many of the issues that we're hoping to delve into deeper today. So without further ado,
más al fondo hoy. Así que ahora vamos a mover a la parte de
Mr. Anand Grover, another human rights leader. Anand is a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. The Commission was created in 2011 and brings together global leaders from the political, economic, and cultural arenas to advocate for drug policies that are based on scientific evidence, human rights, public health, and security to leave no one behind. The Global Commission is an important partner of PRI. Mr. Grover was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health for 6 years, from 2008 to 2014, and is a senior advocate at the Supreme Court of India. Anand, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Olivia,
Yes,
I
we
think
can
you have
hear you
30
now.
minutes. Do you have 30 minutes or 20 or 25?
10 minutes, please.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Thank you very much. I think you're familiar with all the issues concerning women prisoners, but the background to the Bangkok rules are the increasing number of women being incarcerated and their special needs, and how the UN standard minimum rules, which are applicable to everybody, were not sufficient, and therefore special circumstances and special needs of women were to be taken into account. And the Bangkok rules have been framed for that purpose. And they take into account the fact that women do have special needs. Therefore, they recognize and they supplement and they complement both the Nelson Mandela rules, which are then uh, uh, modifying the original rules, the UN Standard Minimal Rules for prisoners in 2015, and the Tokyo rules for alternative to prison. They recognize the special circumstances of women prisoners. They recognize the vulnerability of women prisoners. And therefore, the rules provide for allocation, health services, gender-based risk assessment, social relations, aftercare, and other issues. Now, one of the most important things to remember, and the Bangkok rules as well as the Nelson Mandela rules are founded on very important principles, which is rule 1 of the Nelson Mandela rules, that all persons shall be treated with respect due to their inherent dignity and value as human beings. No prisoner shall be subject, and all prisoners shall be protected from torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. And rule 2.1, which is very important, the present rules shall apply impartially. There shall be no discrimination on the grounds of race. And 2.2, non-discrimination. And individual needs of prisoners have to be taken into account. So one of the most important grounding principle is dignity and non-discrimination. These are also based on the human rights, or in some countries known as fundamental rights, like in my country, which are contained in the International Bill of Rights, particularly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. They also talk about dignity and nobody being subject to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading or punishment. Now, these international instruments make it very clear that these rights are of prisoners and citizens are non-derogable obligations of states. And they also include a very important principle, which is Article 10.3 of the ICCPR, that the penitentiary system shall comprise treatment of prisoners, the essential aim of which is shall be reformation and social rehabilitation. So once you see that that is the principle, the whole confluence of dignity, non-discrimination, and reformation actually impinges on the Bangkok rules. Now, one of the things that commentators have noticed is that the Bangkok rules have not been actually implemented. Even the hosts, Penal Reform International, has noted that there's not even enough data to show that they have actually been implemented. I'll address this issue later on. So discrimination is the overarching principle, and women's special needs have to be taken care of, and therefore special measures should be taken for them. And therefore special measures cannot be discriminatory, and the rules recognize that. But one issue that has come to the fore over a period of time, and more so after the Bangkok rules, is the issue of transgender persons. If trans women are to be taken into account and they're to be considered women, how do we treat them? A recent judgment of the South African Equality Court in Jade September versus Subramani actually addresses that issue. And trans persons and trans women cannot be discriminated, and they have to be allowed to express their gender identity. So that is one issue which is in the offing in the future, which we should look at. But after the Bangkok rules, the same problems persist. Prison population of women is increasing, overcrowding, there is a high level of pre-trial detention, and about 50% of the population is in pre-trial detention. Significant numbers of detainees and prisoners who are convicted are incarcerated because of drug-related offenses. And in fact, as far as women are concerned, they actually are nearly 35% They vary, but more so in Latin America and Asia, where the rates go up to 60% of women being incarcerated for drug-related offenses. Drug-related offenses are one of the largest numbers in not only pre-trial detention, but also of conviction. Pre-trial detention prisoners form about 50% of the population around the world. And unfortunately, for drug laws, there's automatic pre-trial detention, which is very, very common. Um, we see that all over the world, and particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is very common. The healthcare needs of women are not being addressed. The basic reason being that prisons have been designed for men and they have not taken into account uh, uh, women prisoners. More particularly, the healthcare needs of women are not being addressed. And in this context, I want to point out that the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which actually once incorporated either in common law systems or ratified in civil law systems, becomes applicable law. And there's an obligation by the state to make all healthcare goods, facilities, and services available, accessible, acceptable, and of good quality. So a person who goes into prison is necessarily entitled to be treated uh, as that person would be, as she would be outside prison. So women's special needs have to be taken care of, not only in the context of prison, but as if the prison did not exist. And the fundamental premise of constitutional law and international law and even domestic law is that once a woman enters prison, she doesn't lose her basic fundamental and human rights. She loses it only to the extent necessarily because of her imprisonment and basically freedom of movement. All the other rights are intact. So health rights and healthcare facilities and goods have to be made available, accessible, and of good quality to her. And they also have to be acceptable. So reproductive rights, personal hygiene, mothers' rights, drug dependence, they have to be made available, accessible, etc. In my country, there are judgments. One of them, very famous one, Ghia's judgment of the Rajasthan High Court, which makes it clear that any person who is in prison is entitled to these rights, and they are entitled to even be put in a private facility if the state facility is not up to the mark. And right now, I'm arguing a case of a prisoner who's in fact been sent to a private facility, one of the top facilities, because the state facility was not good enough. So that is the level of the rights that a person is entitled to. There's a huge problem of women who are pregnant or mothers, and this is an issue which impacts intergenerationally, because it has been known for quite some time that mothers who have children outside, their children are also at a greater risk of future incarceration. And studies show that this ranges from 50% to 89%, depending on which country you take. So children of mothers who are in prison are likely to be incarcerated. And there are studies to show, UK study shows that 75% of such children may go and commit a crime. So there's continued cycle of institutionalization, which is responsible for a person ending up in prisons. So how do we deal with that? And I think one of the issues that we have to deal with is to think of alternatives in terms of open prisons, because enclosed prisons do not allow a woman's health to be taken care of in a number of ways, particularly mental health, and not allow visitation and contact with the family, which is one of the fundamental issues which actually creates this intergenerational imprisonment and a cycle of that. Also, as I said earlier, there are significant incarceration of drug-related offenders in jail, particularly women, and women have a larger proportion of incarceration because of drug-related offenses, but they are incarcerated not because of committing the major crime, but committing a crime because her partner does actually forces her to do it, or other such issues, or also related to poverty, mental health, and substance abuse prior to entry to prison or when in prison. So we recognize in the Global Commission that the war on drugs has failed. The country which started the war on drugs, the US, is increasingly decriminalization of drug use and possession. So there is a need to decriminalize possession for personal use, and possession for personal use is a significant proportion of women who are inside prisons because of drug-related offenses. If we actually decriminalize uh, possession of drugs, there'll be a large and a substantial reduction in women in prisons and generally prisoners, male or female or transgender. So this is one of the things that has to be done outside prisons, as it were, and taken up as an advocacy and a legal issue. Uh, there's a huge structural issue of violence and sexual abuse and drug related offenses connected. Children who have been subject to abuse, neglect, or instability actually have a high risk of drug use and developing substance use disorders. Women who use drugs are likely to have male intimate partners who initiate them into drug use. The power dynamics, the gender power dynamics, also play a key role in women's drug use patterns. Um, Therefore, we have to think about a situation where the woman in society is empowered so that she can actually negotiate gender relations much better. But this impacts on a woman in a position in prison. Um, a lot of studies actually show that women who are subject to violence and sexual abuse, they land up in jails. And in fact, women, as I said earlier, who are incarcerated for illegal activities, most often they are actually coerced by their abusive partners to do so. They actually participate in the crime minimally. And those women are unfortunately subject to violence continually, even in prison. There are cases, for example, one case of a 15-year-old girl in Brazil who was imprisoned for petty theft but kept in a cell with 20 men and raped. Similarly, there are a number of women who are subject to such ill treatment, torture, or rape. And the consequences of that, it takes a huge toll on the women and actually negative outcomes in terms of uh, health, substance abuse, etc., which leads to reincarceration or recidivism, or that person committing the crimes again. So this also happens if there is little meaningful contact with their families. Families sometimes do not choose to visit the prisoner, and therefore, because there are no adequate rehabilitation measures in jail, there's a lack of rehabilitation care. These actually facilitate um, uh, uh, the improper rehabilitation into society ultimately.
Sorry,
Therefore,
Anand, I have to ask you to conclude.
yes, I
I'm
am going
sorry
to
to interrupt.
I am going to conclude. I'm limiting to my time. So what is the way forward? I think there are some simple steps we can take. I think one of the major steps is to make sure that pre-trial detention is minimized, not for small offenses or petty offenses, not for mothers, not for after investigation is complete, or for drug related offenses. In fact, there should be decriminalization of possession for personal use. In that way, we can actually reduce the prison population to from 33 to 50%. Also, I think there should be open prisons. There's no need to have closed prisons. We have a very good example in Rajasthan in India, and non-custodial measures are very important. And my colleague has actually done a study and a report for the UNDP for Myanmar, where she has actually put out what are the other alternatives to prison we can actually uh, uh, think of, and they can be done at different stages. Pre-trial, you can actually have a warning, caution, or an admonition, fine, bail. During trial, diversion to treatment, probation, and after trial, treatment in lieu of imprisonment, community service, probation, parole, remission. And depending on the law and the legal system, they can be exercised by police, prosecution, or the executive. And that is available in the UNH's literature. So the other thing that I want to just, and this is the final point I want to make, how do we make sure that we implement the Bangkok Rules? I think this is a matter of access to justice. The Bangkok Rules need to be popularized. Academies in countries need to take this up. Lawyers doing legal aid work should be encouraged to use Bangkok Rules. Unfortunately, lawyers don't know about these rules. Drug users organizations and women's organizations should be used to popularize and actually take up these issues and become vital participants in our effort to make sure that there's reduction of women and other prisoners in prisons. Develop ex-prisoners organizations or networks who can work with lawyers. And this has happened, and we can also tap Good Samaritan organizations who work in prisons to use Bangkok Rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anand, and sorry that we cannot give you more time to share your important thoughts. And I think speaking about dignity and non-discrimination and framing the discussion around that is very useful, and those human rights principles need to guide all of our work, including especially with regard to COVID-19 responses. So now I have the pleasure of introducing PRI's Policy and International Advocacy Manager, Trina Lenihan. Trina joined PRI again in September this year after working with us back in 2013 and 2014. Trina is an international human rights lawyer and a child and gender rights expert, among other things. Trina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks. Can you hear me? I'm delighted to be here today to take stock of the progress made towards the implementation of the Bangkok Rules, and also to reflect on some of the challenges we see 10 years on. At PRI, we've led and been involved with many programs in lots of countries to create more effective criminal justice systems that respect rights. We've sought to change the mindsets of judges, of prison staff, probation and detention monitors, and in many cases we have seen change. But 10 years ago, when the rules were adopted, we really did have to start from the beginning. Needless to say, the adoption of the Bangkok Rules in 2010 was a significant milestone for women and all those working with and for women in criminal justice systems. But when the rules were first adopted, there was relatively little knowledge of them, and that was from UN institutions to monitoring bodies and prison administrations. So now, 10 years on, that has certainly changed. So many institutions and civil society organizations, including many of those represented here today and others, have worked tirelessly over the past decade, the awareness of the rules, why they are needed and what needs to be done to make them a reality. We welcome the fact that they're known about and that there is an awareness of the Bangkok Rules, because even if they're not fully implemented yet, the idea at least has been planted, and it is known and acknowledged that adaptations are needed for women in criminal justice systems. Implementation efforts, and there have been many, and we'll hear about some of them today, they've mostly focused on improving the treatment of women in prison through training of prison officers and other key stakeholders. Also the development of rehabilitation programs, many innovative and so on. This is excellent and very much needed, but in parallel to this, we see now that we need at the same time to look right back at the start of the process around criminalization. And this is critical because we've seen that the global female prison population continues to rise, which is in contradiction of what the Bangkok Rules call for. PRI has carried out new analysis, which we'll publish in full next week. And this has found that a significant increase in the number of women in prison worldwide since the rules were adopted in 2010. And this continuing increase in the imprisonment of women globally, in spite of the Bangkok Rules, means we need to redouble our efforts in exposing why so many women are swept into the criminal justice system in the first place, and the
¿Por qué hay tantas mujeres reclusas? Y también mirar la ineficacia de y también
drug policies are a huge driver of women's imprisonment in many countries, particularly in Asia and the Americas. But it's only really been in the last 5 years, and since the UN General Assembly's special session on drugs in 2016, that there's been some realization at the international level on how close the connection is between the so-called war on drugs, the very punitive approach to drug control been in place for the past decades, and women's imprisonment. Harsh drug policies have been directed at all those who participate in organized crime, but the nature of how it is implemented in many places has resulted in the criminalization and imprisonment of people, many of them women, who commit criminally liable offences in a context of victimization and discrimination. And it's not just drug offences. PRI is a member of the regional campaign to decriminalize petty offences in Africa. And here too, we need to consider the particular impact on women, because so many women work in the informal sector and are especially impacted by laws that target informal traders like market workers or sex work. There's also a need to better understand how colonial offences like loitering or vagrancy affect women. We know from our research in Kenya that many women in pretrial detention have been arrested for things like selling alcohol without a license, and many of them were eventually sentenced to community service, and so they never needed to be detained in the first place. And this is actually quite similar to new figures just last week in England, that nearly a third of criminal convictions of women last year were for not paying the television license fee. And the likelihood of women being convicted for non-payment of the license was almost 10 times more than men. Many of the world are criminalized and imprisoned for behaviors that under international law should not be criminalized, including things like adultery, homosexuality, possession of drugs for personal use, also abandoning or changing religious belief, and witchery. In the Central African Republic, for example, women and young girls are frequently imprisoned for sorcery, and the combination of fear around sorcery and many women's lack of financial means to pay for legal representation means that many of those accused may never get an opportunity to have their case heard in court and remain in prison for long times or indefinitely. And so as many countries have continued to implement very punitive or tough on crime policies, women are also experiencing more extreme sentencing. In the US, white women are one of the fastest growing population serving life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And according to the Cornell Center on the death penalty, there are at least 500 women on death row around the world, and maybe more. So while women are sometimes protected from execution under certain circumstances, particularly mothers of infants and young children, those that are sentenced to death are subjected to multiple forms of gender bias. Most women are on death row for the crime of murder, but this is often in relation to the killing of a family member in a context of gender-based violence. Others have been sentenced to death for drug offences, terrorism, adultery, witchcraft, and blasphemy. PRI has also done some research into women who killed their abusers, which found that, with a few exceptions, the criminal justice systems are failing these women by ignoring their trauma and the realities and dynamics of domestic violence that preceded these incidents. So going forward, we know there is a need to shed more light on particular groups of women affected by criminal justice systems. This includes, in particular, the treatment of women in detention in fragile and conflict-affected settings, and also, as we've heard already today, children living in prison with their mothers. This was perhaps one of the reasons that there was an appetite to have specific standards on women, but we haven't really seen any radical moves to get these children and their mothers out of prison. This needs bold action, and we're not talking about huge numbers. An estimated 19,000 children around the world live in prison with a parent, usually mothers, so this is feasible. So there are no shortage of challenges facing women in criminal justice systems, and especially now. So 10 years on from the adoption of the Bangkok Rules, we face a global pandemic where we've seen women somewhat overlooked in strategies for prisons. Women in prison have faced increased hardship during the pandemic as a result of changes to prison regimes that have failed to take account of their specific needs. In some prisons, we've seen that women have gone without sanitary pads and other essential items, and that's either because resources were redirected, or they're often provided by families or local charities who could no longer visit or have access to prisons. Release mechanisms in some countries have also made provision for pregnant or breastfeeding women, or those with children living with them in prison. But beyond that limited segment, many countries haven't included women adequately in their release schemes. Some have also excluded drug-related offences, which can disproportionately impact women in countries where higher proportions of women than men are in prison for low-level drug offences. So we believe this demonstrates the very real need for renewed energy and more engagement and bold solutions to tackle all of the issues that women in criminal justice systems face. There needs to be a system-wide approach, which includes legal reforms and changes in sentencing, as well as adaptations in alternatives to imprisonment and gender-specific treatment in detention. So PRI will continue to find these bold solutions together, and we look forward to working with partners over the next decade to continue implementing the Bangkok Rules so that every woman that comes into contact with the criminal justice system can have their rights better. I'm sorry for my poor connection today, but I hope you've been able to hear me, and thanks. I look forward to more discussion later.
Thank you, Trina. We heard you perfectly, but we couldn't see you, unfortunately. I think, yeah, the comments so far about the impact specifically of drug-related offences on women make it very timely now to hear from women who have lived experience and those who are also on the front line of helping women in criminal justice systems, often because of drug policies. So firstly, I'd like to invite Rosma Karlina to share her views on the impacts of drug policies on women in Indonesia. Rosma is the Women's Coordinator at Action for Justice Indonesia, an organisation which provides support to drug users and vulnerable people seeking justice through legal education and legal assistance towards social justice for all Indonesian people. She has worked on narcotic issues since 2006, including as a paralegal and with a focus on the issue of women who use drugs. Please take the floor, Rosma.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. 15 years ago, in 2005 to be precise, I was convicted for possession of narcotic with only 2.25 gram of evidence. 2.5 gram evidence. I was sentenced to be 3-year prison sentence, which I served in the prison in the city of Bogor. Padang is the only prison in Bogor that has the special block for female prisoner. In the end, I spent a total of 80 months in prison, having received a special remission following my request for conditional release. From the beginning of my arrest to the end of my detention, my family and I spent a lot of money during my arrest. I was asked for a bribe to get a reduced sentence. In the prison, I had to pay for the most basic of human rights, just to ensure that I had at least some basic condition. For example, I had to pay room money, so I did not sleep on the floor. I once refused to pay for a bed, and I so was forced to sleep on the floor. That time, I also got beat up by so-called is leader of the room, who was also a fellow prisoner. I slept on the floor of the room that had a maximum capacity of 65 people, but the content is around 90 people. You can imagine how crowded that room was. My fellow prisoner and I had to fight for breath. People are allowed to smoke inside, so the air was mixed with cigarette smoke, which made it even more stuffy. Ultimately, prison did not teach me anything. It definitely did not make me stop using drugs. While I was in prison, I could still use drugs, which were widely available. Drugs were available, but clean needles or other safe equipment for reducing harm while using was not available. But this was a problem considering how overcrowded the prison was. The prison only left me a feeling with anger and resentment because I was experiencing most often inside is extortion and torture. After my release from prison, I worked in narcotic control of program and became a prison health worker. In 2017, a view like a minded friend, I created an organization promoting access to justice based in the city of Bogor. It's called Aksi Keadilan Indonesia, which means it's Indonesia X for Justice. For its first 2 years, the organization was not officially registered, but we still work to promote our goal. We provide a legal assistance through peer paralegal who support persons who become involved with law for drug-related case. Besides providing legal assistance, we also document human rights violations committed by law enforcement officials. Much of the legal assistance we provide in the first few years was done on voluntary basis without any donor financial support. In January 2020, we finally officially registered our organization. Since September 2020, we documented more than 300 complaints of family of persons who were arrested on drug-related charge. Of the 300 reports that we are documented, 50% were transactional, meaning that a bribe was exchanged. 40% of the cases were resolved at the police level without any legal process, and we referred them to the government-run rehabilitation. And the only 10% case actually went to court and underwent trial and received equality legal assistance. The proportion of the case were bribe or other form of extortion took place in exchange to lesser sentence in narcotic case, unfortunately very high. 15 years after I served my prison sentence, the problem of incarceration in Indonesia, especially of drug case, has not changed much. There is still a lot of extortion, irregularity, and lack of human conditions. When talking about women and prison, there are many problems. Many women are still imprisoned under the same roof as men. There are some women only prison, but although there have been efforts and advocacy to improve facility and protect human rights, there are still many challenges. For example, for women especially, there are not sufficient access to reproductive health service center or service for mother and children. The government do not pay enough attention to the need of baby in the prison who are still dependent to their mother. Such appropriate service should be facilitated by government. There is issue of sanitary pad of menstruations. Currently, prison prohibit women from bringing this in. If you want to use sanitary pad, In the prison, you must buy or double price inside the prison. Having a mobile phone to communicate with the outside world prohibited, which become a loophole of exploitation. Prisoners have to risk of being transferred to another prison or face other sanctions if the raid occur or their communication device are found. Another problem also occur in prison where women are not separated from men. Often a female prisoner who gives birth in the prison is forcefully separated from her baby because they are not facilitated to accommodate the need of the mother and children. In what is one of the cruelest practice that happen in prison, a few hours after giving birth, the mother is forced to return to her cell, not to mention the problem of abuse, which is often faced by female prisoners who have participated in the same activity with male prisoners. I have mentioned earlier on how common extortion in prison to get access to even the most basic human right, not to mention the ongoing problem of the overcapacity, which has resulted in unsafe and unsanitary condition and high rate physical and psychological violence. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, new problems have arisen with the lack of access to health service in prison and the overcapacity of prison in Indonesia. In practice, this is inversely proportional to the incessant targeting by police of people who use drugs. In fact, drug enforcement activity have interfered or continue as usual, and so condition is prison have remained the same, overcrowded, unsafe, and unhealthy. This result are very high risk of COVID-19 transmissions in prison. I want to conclude by underlining that regard of a person conviction and prison sentence in the state only has the right to reduce or limit person liberty. People who are deprived of their liberty also have equal rights that must be fulfilled by the state. These rights do not end in the prison. These include right to education, right to health, and several specific rights for women. If government cannot fulfill our human right in prison, then it should be not imprisonment us at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosma, for sharing your story. It is extremely courageous, and also congratulations on the important work that you're doing to help others. And we look forward to staying in touch with you and supporting each other's work. I think many of the systemic issues that you spoke about and kind of the human costs that those issues have on people are quite common across the world, unfortunately. And certainly in the Americas, we see, like in Asia, that there are high numbers of women in prison for drug-related offences. And so with that in mind, I would like to now move to Mexico, where it's very early in the morning, where we're lucky to have two speakers join us. Firstly, Corina Camilo, who works with Equus Justice, a feminist organization in Mexico, which seeks to promote a gender perspective in justice institutions and administration, and transform current institutional responses to violations of women's human rights. And then we will hear from Gabby Cruz, who is from the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. Gabby was released from prison in 2019 and is going to share her experiences with us today. And a special thanks, as I know it's very, very early there. If you have been listening in English, you will now need to make sure you select the English channel, as Corina and Gabby will be speaking in Spanish. Karina, the floor is yours.
Hola, muy buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches, según donde se encuentren.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending where you are. First of all, I'd like to thank Penal Reform International for having me here. And of course, I'd like to thank Gabby and all the people who are listening to us. I work for Justicia. It's one of the few feminist organizations in Mexico and in the region in general that works with women who are in contact with the criminal justice system. So when we look at women who are incarcerated, we can't ignore the impact that drug policies have, and both in the preventive stage as well as during sentences. And it's something that really affects the population of incarcerated women across the world, but especially in Latin America and Asia. And in Latin America, there's an extremely high rate of women who are incarcerated due to drug-related offenses, and they're more likely to be, the proportion is higher compared to men. And so we need to look at the causes here. And they're also, these causes are also the primary obstacle when it comes to achieving justice here. And the agencies that oversee international policies on this level have noted this, and they've and it's clear that we need much more concentrated messages, and we need stronger messages, and we really need to work to address these obstacles and the reasons why there are so many women in prison for drug-related offenses. And these include things like the lack of access to alternative measures and the criminalization of drug use. And there's also a serious lack of programs geared towards reintegrating women into society once they leave prison. And that's it's an issue that the Bangkok Rules does touch on, but it's not something that's been implemented yet. There's also the issue of adolescents and children in prison. And once again, this is an issue we really see in Latin America and Asia. And that we see a lot of female youths who are in compulsory treatment, in compulsory detention in these countries. And so they're actually being affected on different levels, and there's intersectionality there with how they're a vulnerable population being affected in negative ways by drug policies. And so I met Gabby a few years ago, and she was detained in a women's prison in Oaxaca. And so we created a series of documentaries to really get to know women who were incarcerated in Mexico on a deeper level, and to understand their struggles and the issues that they face, particularly women who are there for drug-related offenses. And most of them have stories, they have backgrounds of trauma, they've suffered violence, and this is something that plays a huge part in their stories and the trajectory that's led them to being incarcerated. And so we were in contact with Gabby and her colleagues, and after she left prison, she also she's done us the favor of being with us here today, and she's going to share her story as well. And so, Gabby, I'm really excited to be here with you today, and we're really looking forward to hearing your story. Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon. I don't know what time it is there. Sorry, I can't hear very.
A ver, ¿ya me escuchan ahora?
Ahora un poco mejor, si puedes
Okay.
estar muy cerca del micrófono.
Buenos días. Sí. Okay. Hola, muy buenos días.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. I'm Gabriela Cruz. I was incarcerated in 2012, and I was in prison for 7 years. And so, and that time was extremely difficult for me. I have a daughter with cerebral palsy, and she was there with me for 3 years. And then afterwards, they had to take her to receive treatment. And so I asked for help and support from the directors.
Subsecretaría, y no me quisieron brindar el apoyo para que mi hijo recibiera tratamiento estando en
To
estancia.
support my daughter. And so we had to make a request to the judge asking for the opportunity to take my child to therapy. And my charge, they told me that it was that I had to complete my sentence because that was my sentence. And we make mistakes sometimes because we're in difficult situations, or because we in my case, my child needed treatment, and they have cerebral palsy, and so I really needed the money to be able to take care of their health. So that's why when they told me that it doesn't have anything to do with this, your offense, and you have to serve your time for your offense. And so I'm free now, and I'm happy. I'm very happy to be with my children. But it's so once you're out of prison, one of the issues is that when you start to look for work, a lot of the times one of the basic requirements is that you don't have any prior criminal offenses. I'm currently on probation, and I still don't have the right to have official identification. I don't have, so it's difficult for me to find work because I don't have the right documentation, and it's very, very difficult. And not just the impact of being inside prison and not being able to see my children, my family. My family also had to face a lot of hardship due to a lot of things. And so there's also the impact of being outside of prison once you get out, of not being able to find work, not having the correct documentation, not being able to get hired because police won't hire people with prior offenses. It's honestly extremely difficult, and I still need to finish my probation, and I'm still on probation. So it's also there's so many things. There's so many things that really hold you back and make things difficult for you after you come out of the prison. It's difficult both inside and outside. There's things that really make things difficult, and there's a lot that we need to fight for. There's so many things we need to fight against discrimination, and we as women who have been incarcerated, there's so many things that stigma that we have to fight against, and of course it's things that we need to struggle against on top of the already difficult situation of being someone who's been incarcerated, because it's somewhere where you're told what to wear, you're told you can't choose what to eat, you don't have
color de la ropa, los comportamientos, son muchísimas cosas que tenemos
over these choices. When you're imprisoned, for children as well, there's a lack of choice over these things, and they're telling you what to wear and what to eat. So for my child, for example, I have to watch their food intake. They need to be they follow a specific diet. And a lot of times there were things that were not allowed inside, or they were very limited. And so we were, and in terms of the bed size, the beds are tiny, and it was, you had to be all curled up, and it was very cold, and it was, you had to kind of struggle to not fall out of bed at night. And it was kind of, every night was figuring out a way to not be cold, because a lot of times the areas that we were in, they don't actually have doors, it's just bars. So it's extremely cold. And where I was, it was extremely, extremely cold. So that was something I had to deal with. And while taking care of my child. And so at one point, I had to make the difficult decision of either continuing to remain with my child and continuing to take care of him, or giving him up and letting him be somewhere where he could have a better quality of life, where he could receive the diet that he needed to follow, where he would be better taken care of. So I had to make this very difficult decision of giving my child up temporarily so that he could have a better quality of life. There are many different very difficult things like this that we have to deal with. And thank you very much for listening to my story and hearing my experience.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for joining us today and telling us your story. I know that it's your first major speaking engagement, and with 150 plus people on the line, I think we're all very touched and inspired by your courage. Many of the issues that you raise, again, are very common across, we know that they're common in many of the countries where PRI works. And there's just so many damaging consequences of women's imprisonment that you outline, very practical ones and very serious ones for young children as well, that I just want to kind of reiterate again something that has been said around kind of why are states continuing to imprison women at the rates they are, and why are those rates rising? And there really needs to be some bold action, and I hope in 5 years or 10 years we can have another event like this and report the opposite trend in statistics. So thank you again, Gabby. I'm now going to turn to Africa, where it's evening, I believe, to give Jane Courier the floor. Jane is the Chief Executive Officer from Faraja Foundation in Kenya. And Jane will be sharing the wonderful work that Faraja do in implementing the Bangkok Rules there. Also some of the challenges. And I know that Faraja works very closely with prison and probation services and have implemented a range of empowerment programs for women in criminal justice systems. So Jane, the floor is yours. And I think we also have a PowerPoint to load. So yes, bear with us for a minute.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is 6 o'clock in Kenya. It's good to be here. Kenya has actually made some good strides in the implementation of Bangkok Rules. We can go to the next slide, please. That just shows our vision, our mission, our motto. I think everyone can read, so I'll not go into that. The next slide, please. But just to mention, Faraja in Kiswahili is consolation. So we mainly console people within the prisons, within probation, after prison. So we mainly do a lot of consolation. Then we are saying, despite the share in prison of women, there are very few, but we realize there's significant numbers are rising. And the Bangkok Rules basically are to support these initiatives. So in Kenya, we want to train the prison officers to be able to help the women who are in prison, the female offenders, to make their lives better while in prison. So we are saying, despite the small number of offenders we have, in Kenya and in Africa as a whole, many women, we are seeing them more in prison. Next slide, please. We have just a statistics to show the crimes, that the pathways, the background to pathways to prison in Kenya. And we have some percentages there, as you can see. The highest percent we have, this is according to 2016 report, is violent offenses, which includes kidnapping, manslaughter, robbery with violence, infanticide, and murder. Those are the main, that's the highest percentage so far. We have next following closely is offenses on property offenses. You find sometimes we don't have very good succession plan in Kenya. So you find maybe a husband dies and a woman is left with nothing. The property that the husband has sometimes is taken by relatives. So you'll find such cases are very high in Africa. We also have 12% there, we have alcoholic drinks. Somebody had mentioned about informal sort of employment in Africa. And we find in Kenya, because of unemployment rates being very high, poverty rates being very high, you find people doing jobs that are not very legal. This could be selling of illegal alcoholic drinks. And that is just because of survival. So you find that kind of offenses also are very high in Kenya. Drugs is not very high, but 8% is also very high. So you find, somebody has just talked about drugs, but in Kenya, we wouldn't say it's so much, but 8% is still quite a high population number. Next slide, please. So we are saying that since 2010, since the Bangkok Rules were ratified, a lot has happened in Kenya. One of the challenges we have is not a challenge really, but the training of prison officers doesn't quite look at men or women. You are trained as a prison officer. Your work is to go out there and do your job. So you'll find, since the Bangkok Rules, now we are trying to make the prisons more women-friendly. We are trying to train as many women as possible. And Faraja, like Olivia has said, works very closely with the correctional facilities. This is prisons probation. So you can see here prison officers, ladies being trained, and the trainers are actually prison officers. That's a man from prison training. We partner with them very closely. So training is one of the key areas that we have seen since 2010, and we have trained quite a number of prison officers because we want the prison officers, all of them, the females, if possible, to be trained as we train the offenders as well. Next slide, please. Looking at the various areas as on the Bangkok Rules, you can see there we have, like I mentioned in the previous slide, training is capacity development is a key intervention in Kenya. We have about 33 female prison institutions in Kenya, and I'm proud to say all the ladies in these prisons, the officer in charges have been trained on the Bangkok Rules and how to be gender sensitive and on various ways to the pathways to female imprisonment. After we train the senior officers, we cascade to the other officers, and I'm proud also to say another 100 plus, actually 100 plus female officers across different ranks, from the junior officers to senior officers have been trained, and we look forward to training more. Actually, this year, just before COVID, we were planning to train over 100, but obviously COVID happened and there's lockdown in our facilities, so we have not been able to do that. But hopefully next year we can train more, or possibly even try to do virtual trainings. We are also saying that female offenders have been trained in many other areas, including counseling, including business startup skills, including parenting, so that we make lives better for them in prison and out of prison. In terms of registration in Kenya, we have individual files are open for all the offenders. Once you get into prison, a file is opened for you. Admission that we have made, all children left at home are given, people are told what that they're in prison, information is shared, telephones are provided to call for people to know that one is in prison, and then their properties are kept properly. Safety and security, we have good search rooms now. Offenders are informed of why they are in the prisons, how long they're going to be in the prisons, and then we have even ICT equipment to help just be able to transfer information. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Jean, can you have the next slide? Yes, thank you. So achievements, I'll go very fast. Like I said, we are very proud of very many achievements in Kenya. We, like, for example, you can see the photos there. We have child-friendly areas in all the prisons that we have women. We have changed our systems of when you're counting. We have, you can see these are just photos showing what has happened in Kenya in terms of making women's lives better. We have counseling happening here. We have a lady showing off what she has been doing in the prisons. We have provided a lot of materials, including machines, for the women to be trained. Next slide, please. Jean, the next slide. Can we have the next slide, please?
One more minute, Jane, please.
Oh, okay. So as she looks for, oh yeah, so we are seeing, oh, can you go to the next one, please? Last one, please, before this one. Then we have challenges, of course. We can't say we don't have any challenges. Like people have said, we have overcrowding and congestion. This is what I was looking for. You can see we have really tried in partnership with the prison service to improve. We provide beds in women prisons. You can see ladies very happy there that at least they can sleep on beds. We have daycare centers for the children who are with their mothers in prison. We have good cooking facilities for the women, just to improve the lives of these women in the prisons. Next slide, please. The next slide would be on challenges. And we are saying, yeah, some of the challenges in implementation is overcrowding and congestion. Like I said, Africa, we have very high poverty rates. So if sometimes you find many women in prison, you find illiteracy. Many of these ladies in the prisons don't have education. So sometimes training becomes a little bit difficult. You have to use mother tongue in some instances to be able to train. We also have funding. Obviously, like somebody mentioned, prisons were initially meant for men. So now trying to get the prison facilities to be female friendly, you require a lot of funds. So Faraja, in partnership with the prison service and other agencies, we try and change the infrastructure to suit women so that their lives in prison are better, so that your life doesn't change so much from inside to outside. Next slide, please. And that is the last slide. But before my time is up, I would like to say that I think Kenya in Africa has really made great strides. Like I said before, we have trained over 200 women officers, and we are hoping in the next 2-3 years, another 300 or so will be trained in the Bangkok Rules. You realize in Kenya, we have what we call the open door policy. This is a policy that the government has put in place where partners like Faraja can access the prisons, and we're able to go there, train, do other activities, talk to the ladies, including the inmates. So I would say we have done quite well in terms of improving lives of offenders, including the men and the children in the criminal justice system. But obviously we still have a lot to do. And in partnership with PRI and other organizations, we are hoping that in the next 5 years, we shall have all the 5,000 plus female officers in our institutions in Kenya trained on Bangkok Rules, and then we treat our offenders better. And the other challenge I would say we are trying to work on is on reintegration. You realize in prisons in Kenya, once you leave prison, it can be very challenging because of stigma, because of the societies, we are very punitive. So what we are working on very closely as Faraja is to make sure every woman that is leaving prison, we try and get her something to do, a startup or small business to be able to do, talk to the communities out there. We are talking to the people in the communities, having workshops, awareness creation workshops that give people a second chance, because everyone that is in prison realizes they have done a mistake. Some actually are not criminals. They found themselves in situations. So Faraja is working very closely on what you're calling re-entry or reintegration, because if we don't do that, you'll find women coming back, because out there it's very, very, very hostile. So some of them possibly even say prison is a little bit better. So we are making sure that everybody that leaves prison gets a better life, and we hold their hands and improve their lives. The youth in the prisons, we have girls, we have young boys below 18 years. We try and give them a second chance as well, pay for their school fees so that we make sure they don't return back to prison as adults. So thank you very much, PRI, and everyone else for giving the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, very much. And I would agree that we have seen progress in Kenya, and I think a lot of that, well, one thing that has contributed to that progress is leadership. we worked with the probation agency in Kenya, and right at the kind of management level, there was very much a commitment to implementing the Bangkok Rules. So last but certainly not least, I would like to introduce our last speaker today from the Thailand Institute of Justice, a very close partner of PRI. The TIJ and PRI have somewhat walked together for the last decade in our work to promote the Bangkok Rules. And so it's an honor to give Dr. Nati, an advisor with the TIJ, the floor to speak about their model prison project in Thailand. Please go ahead, Dr. Nati. Sorry, you're on mute still. There we go, now we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to speak on the topic of the implementation of the Bangkok Rules on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the Bangkok Rule. So on this occasion, I would like to extend my appreciation to Penal Reform International for organizing this event. The Bangkok Rule is very important for TIJ because TIJ was initially set up in order to promote and support the implementation of the Bangkok Rule among various countries, including Thailand. But we realized that before promoting the implementation of the Bangkok Rules in other countries, we should do it in Thailand first to show that the Bangkok Rules can be implemented in countries that have limited resources and difficulty in running the prison. But when we started to promote the Bangkok Rule in Thai prison, we found that the attitude and mindset of the prison staff is very important. Many of them think that the Bangkok Rule cannot be applied in the Thai prison because it is the Western standard, and because of the limited budget, limited staff, and the old prison facility, and the problem of the overcrowding in prison. So therefore, TIJ and the Thai Department of Correction set up the model prison project to be an example for the Thai prison staff to see that it can work, it can be done. So we start the project by setting up the index of implementation of the Bangkok Rule, initially set up by Penal Reform International. So we translate it in Thai and modify it to fit Thailand's social context. And we use this index as criteria for evaluate the Bangkok Rules model prison. After that, we classify women facility into 3 types. The first one is a women prison. The second is large women unit in male prison. And the third is a small women unit in the male prison. At present, we have 8 women prison in Thailand, and we have 22 large women unit in male prison, and we have 40 small women unit in male prison. So we select one good example from each category to be the Bangkok Rule model prison. After that, we provide technical assistance to this selected model prison in 3 aspects: peopleware, software, and hardware. For peopleware, we provide training for prison staff the emphasis was on the changing their mindset and attitude, particularly on their awareness of the gender-specific needs of women. And we emphasize on, we use the learning by doing approach by the prison staff to visit other prisons to see the best practice in other prison, and to see how to implement the Bangkok Rule. For hardware, we provide advice and some small batches to modify some parts of their prison facility, such as the healthcare facility and children playground or nursery, the library, and the canteen, and some dormitory. For software, we provide a technician assistant to set up several programs related to hygiene and healthcare, mother and child care in prison, searching technique, vocational training, educational training, and the pre-release program. For example, at the Ayutthaya prison, we let them create their own program for implemented of the pre-release program. At Ayutthaya prison, they built the cook and coffee shop, and this coffee shop is run by prison, but employed by work by inmate, the newly released inmate who come to work in this coffee shop. Some are waiters, some are cook in the coffee shop. Also, the customer who visit this coffee shop, they can write some inspired notes into the notepad on the board of the coffee shop, and this to show that the outside society is accept them if they are released, go back to society. And this notepad will be sent to a prisoner inside the prison. So this coffee shop is very popular, and there are a lot of customers come to this workshop. So this is one of example of the program that we give some advice to the prison. So at the year end of the project, the Bangkok Rule Model Prison Committee, comprising of university professors, were sent to evaluate the prison in according with the index of the implementation. So in 2015, we had 3 model prisons. In 2016, we have 3 out of 6. 2017, we have 4 out of 5. In 2018, we have 2 out of 8. 2019, we have 3 out of 10. And 2020, we not coming out yet. So altogether, we have 15 out of 72 female facility in Thailand. So as you can see from the map that the model prison is located all around Thailand, and in every part of the country, so that it will be center for study of the other prison in that area to see the model prison. But like any project, the model prison project has some limitation due to the various factors. Therefore, so we plan to reassess the model prison every year or every 3 years to ensure that sustainability of their good practice. We know that the model prison project is not perfect, but this project serves as a sandbox for correctional practitioners to apply international standards into their daily work. And is it our hope that this project created a stepping stone towards the full implementation of the Bangkok Rule in the future? So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nati. It's good to present all of the TIJ in Thailand's work around the Bangkok Rules, and we look forward to following the project as it continues into the next years. We have a couple of minutes left, and there were some questions. Some were answered already, but I would like to perhaps direct this one to Karina or Gabby or Rosma, around kind of enhancing women who are in prison, enhancing their voices in decision making. The commentator rightly said, lack of choice and agency degrades women's status, and so we must work towards addressing this problem. Do you very briefly have any best practices for enhancing women prisoners' voices in decision making?
Shall I answer, Olivia?
Yes,
Yeah?
please go
Okay.
ahead.
Bueno, creo que en América Latina hemos...
So I think in Latin America, we're seeing some very strong examples, or very clear examples of women who are really raising their voices. They're really sharing their experiences. They're really and it's often linked. It goes hand in hand with the feminism movement. In Latin America, in terms of these issues, I think what's really worked is creating alliances between civil society organizations. For example, Humanas in Colombia, or Humans in Colombia, is one of the organizations that we've worked with in conjunction with support from the Washington Office for Latin America. And that's to work with women who are incarcerated. We've really been working to kind of carve out a space for ourselves and a seat at the table within these organizations, because we really need to raise awareness and to share our experiences and to elevate and amplify the voices of these women from countries such as Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, etc. And so in a lot of countries, incarcerated women do have the support of these organizations. And I think that this is a start, listening to the stories and testimonies of these women. But the next step is really creating concrete change and really getting this on the agenda as the next step in terms of feminist activism.
Thank you, Karina. Well, it is now 15:30 GMT, and I know that it's very late where some of our participants and panelists are, so I don't want to go over time. So all there is to say really is that we are delighted so many people have engaged in this event today, and we invite you all to sign our civil society call to action, which calls for full implementation of the Bangkok Rules. It's open for signatures until Monday, and we will share the link for the 5 languages that we have the call to action for. We will be publishing this next week, and I would like to extend sincere gratitude to all of our distinguished speakers and panelists today, and to also for all of our participants who have joined us. And I sincerely hope that we can use the energy and the stories and testimonies and examples of best practice today to push for greater implementation of the Bangkok Rules, which in the end is about women's rights, the right to dignity, the right to non-discrimination. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you on a future event in person or on Zoom soon.